$50 million. That's how much debt buried the farmers of Kearney County in a single catastrophic spring, while his neighbors mortgaged their grandfather's land for shiny $500,000 tractors with leather seats, and GPS one stubborn man refused. He kept his rusted iron, and he outlasted them all. The fever hit Kearney County in the early days of November, riding in on the back of $7 corn and a massive federal tax loophole. It wasn't a biological sickness, but it was just as contagious. They called it the green paint disease. In the span of 3 weeks, the local implement dealerships, primarily the sprawling Plains Equipment Group out on Highway 30, were completely emptied of new inventory. Flatbed trailers rolled through town day and night, hauling gargantuan factory-fresh John Deere X9, combines Exact-Emerge planters, and articulated tractors that looked more like interstellar spacecraft than farming implements. At the center of this buying frenzy was Derek Whitmore. At 34, Derek was the golden boy of Kearney County agriculture. He was charismatic, ambitious, and operated his farm less like a generational stewardship and more like a Silicon Valley startup. When corn prices spiked to record highs, Derek didn't use the windfall to pay down his existing operating notes. Instead, he saw leverage. He saw expansion. In one afternoon, sitting in the sterile, glass-walled office of Heartland Ag Star Financial, Derek signed his name to $4.2 million in new equipment loans. He bought 3 new S780 combines, 2 400-horsepower tractors, and a fleet of grain carts. You have to spend money to avoid taxes, and you have to scale to survive, Derek told the men gathered around the scarred wooden tables at the local farmers' co-op. He tapped the screen of his iPad, showing off his new cloud-based yield mapping software. We're leaving money on the table running ancient machinery. This new tech pays for itself in efficiency. The bank practically begged me to take the money at 2.9%. Sitting 2 tables over, stirring a black coffee that had gone cold, was Clive Barrow. Clive was 61 years old, a man carved out of old leather and stubborn principles. His hands were permanently stained with grease, and his operation, Barrow Farms, consisted of 1,400 acres of mostly dryland corn and soybeans. While Derek and the rest of the county were trading in 5-year-old tractors because they lacked Bluetooth and massaging seats, Clive was currently nursing a 1998 Case 1H 2388 combine through another harvest. To Clive, debt was a predator. It was a wolf that slept on your porch. As long as the weather was good, it stayed quiet. But the moment the rain stopped, it would tear your throat out. "You're awful quiet, Clive," Derek called out across the co-op, a smug grin playing on his face. "Plains Equipment has a lightly used 2018 combine on the lot. I could have Nathaniel at the bank run the numbers for you. Step out of the Stone Age." "I'm fine right where I am, Derek," Clive replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "My iron might not talk to a satellite, but it also doesn't talk to the bank on the 1st of every month." The room chuckled, but it was a nervous sound. Most of the men in that room had already signed their own multi-million-dollar notes. They looked at Clive not with respect, but with pity. In their eyes, Clive was a dinosaur waiting for the meteor. The pressure didn't just come from arrogant neighbors. It came from inside Clive's own house. His nephew Bradley, who had come back to the farm after earning an agribusiness degree from the state university, was practically vibrating with frustration. That evening, standing in the drafty tin-roofed machine shed, as Clive welded a cracked auger tube on the old Case combine, Bradley finally snapped. "Uncle Clive, we are getting killed on efficiency," Bradley shouted over the hiss and crackle of the welding torch. "Derek Whitmore is planting at 10 miles an hour with his new Kinsey rig. We're crawling at 4. He's going to farm 5,000 acres next year, and we're stuck at 1,400. Nathaniel Finch from the bank called me today. He said he can get us a line of credit for $1 million easily. Section 179 tax deductions mean the government is practically paying us to buy new equipment. Clive flipped up his welding mask, his eyes pale blue and sharp as shattered ice, locked onto his nephew. Nathaniel Finch is a salesman in a suit, Brad, Clive said quietly. He doesn't sell tractors, he sells debt. Section 179 is a trap. You buy a $500,000 tractor to save $100,000 in taxes, and now you owe $400,000 you didn't need to spend. What happens when corn drops back to $4? What happens when fertilizer doubles? That shiny tractor still demands a $50,000 payment every December. You can't predict a crash, Bradley argued, throwing his hands up. The market is fundamentally shifted. China is buying everything. Ethanol is booming. You're letting fear paralyze this farm. I'm letting history protect it, Clive countered, turning back to his weld. My grandfather lost half our ground in the 80s farm crisis because he bought into the same lie Derek Whitmore is buying right now. I own this land. I own this shed. I own this broken combine. The bank owns Derek. We aren't signing a thing. A week later, the county paper published a glossy front-page feature on Derek Whitmore, dubbing him the future of Midwest agronomy. There was a drone photograph of his 3 immaculate green combines sweeping across a golden field in perfect satellite-guided formation. Clive clipped the article out, not out of jealousy, but as a reminder. He pinned it to the corkboard in his farm shop, right next to the paid-off promissory note from his grandfather's surviving acreage. The lines were drawn. The county was drunk on cheap money and high yields. But Clive knew the sober morning was coming, and when it did, it was going to be brutal. The harvest of 2022 was one for the history books. Nature conspired with the markets to create a perfect storm of profitability for Kearney County. The rains came precisely when the corn was silking, and a dry, crisp autumn allowed for a fast, frictionless harvest. Derek Whitmore's gamble appeared to the untrained eye to be an absolute masterstroke. His new combines, equipped with dual-rotor technology and automated threshing adjustments, chewed through the fields at a staggering pace. His operation pulled in yields of 240 bushels an acre. With his grain bins overflowing, Derek strutted through the county like a conquering king. He traded in his year-old pickup for a loaded heavy-duty dually, and bought his wife a vacation home down in the Ozarks. But the real aggression began in the winter, during the quiet months when leases were negotiated. Armed with his iPad full of impressive yield data and a massive bank-backed operating line, Derek went on the offensive. He began aggressively approaching absentee landlords, the widows and city-dwelling children of retired farmers, offering exorbitant cash rents. The going rate in Kearney County had always hovered around $250 an acre. Derek was offering $400. It was a predatory expansion, and Clive Barrow was the first casualty. For 22 years, Clive had farmed the Miller 80, a prime flat rectangle of black dirt adjacent to his own property. He had treated that soil like his own, carefully managing the nutrient runoff rotating crops religiously, and fixing the drainage tiles out of his own pocket. The handshake agreement with old Arthur Miller had stood firm until Arthur passed away. The land shifted to Arthur's daughter, a real estate agent living in Chicago who had never driven a tractor in her life. When Clive called her in early December to confirm the lease for the upcoming year, the silence on the phone was heavy. "Clive, I'm so sorry," she said, though her voice lacked genuine warmth. But Derek Whitmore's Agricultural LLC contacted the trust. "He's offering us nearly double what you're paying, and he guarantees the rent upfront in cash. He even sent us a beautiful portfolio of his operation. It's strictly a business decision for the trust. I hope you understand." When Clive hung up the phone, he stood in his kitchen for a long time, staring out the window at the snow drifting across the fields. Bradley was sitting at the kitchen island, his face tight with anger. "He took the miller ground?" Bradley asked. Clive gave a slow, silent nod. "I told you, Uncle Clive. I told you this would happen. We're getting choked out. Derek is going to buy up the whole county while we sit here patching tires." "Let him have it," Clive said, though the words tasted like ash. "Do the math, Brad. $400 an acre rent. He's putting $200 an acre in fertilizer down. Seed is $120. Equipment depreciation and fuel is another $150. He needs 200 bushels an acre just to break even, and that's assuming corn stays at $6. It's an illusion. He's running on a treadmill over a cliff." But the loss stung. It eroded Clive's standing in the community. When he drove into town, the conversations at the gas station would suddenly stop. The perception was clear. Derek was the predator, and Clive was the dying prey. Then came the spring of 2023, and with it the first ominous cracks in Derek's shiny empire. The global markets, ever volatile, began to shift. The Federal Reserve, battling inflation, hiked interest rates with violent speed. Suddenly, the variable rate loans Derek and the rest of the county had taken out were no longer costing them 2.9%. They were creeping toward 7%. At the same time, geopolitical tensions sent the cost of anhydrous ammonia, the critical nitrogen fertilizer needed for corn, skyrocketing from $600 a ton to nearly $1,600. The financial vice was tightening, but the most dramatic blow came from the very technology Derek had bet his farm on. It was mid-May. The planting window in Kearney County was shrinking fast due to weeks of relentless, unseasonable rain. Finally, a 5-day stretch of dry weather opened up. Every farmer in the county was racing against the clock. Corn planted after May 20th lost significant yield potential with every passing day. Derek pulled his flagship tractor, a massive $500,000 John Deere 8RX, into a muddy 600-acre field, towing his 24-row ExactEmerge planter. He lowered the implement, engaged the auto steer, and hit the throttle. The tractor moved exactly 40 feet before a piercing alarm shrieked through the soundproof climate-controlled cab. The digital dashboard flashed violent red. Code E104. Critical emissions sensor failure. Engine derate engaged. Consult authorized dealer. The tractor's computer, detecting a fault in the exhaust after-treatment system, automatically restricted the engine's power to an idle to prevent theoretical environmental damage. The machine was paralyzed. Derek frantically mashed buttons, turning the ignition off and on, trying to reset the system. Nothing worked. Panic setting in, Derek called the service manager at Plains Equipment Group. "I need a tech out here right now," Derek yelled into his phone, staring at the storm clouds gathering on the western horizon. "I've got 5,000 acres to plant, and my 8RX just bricked itself." "Derek, I'm sorry, man," the service manager replied, sounding exhausted. "Every sensor in the county is throwing codes because of the humidity. I've got 12 guys ahead of you. It'll be 3 days before I can get a laptop out there to unlock the software." 3 days. It's going to rain in 2. "Just give me the bypass code. I can turn a wrench. I'll bypass the sensor." "You know I can't do that, Derek. It's locked by corporate. It's a proprietary software block. You try to bypass it, you void the warranty on a $500,000 machine. You just have to wait." Derek slammed his hands against the leather steering wheel, screaming into the silent, useless cab. Half a mile away, separated only by a county blacktop, Clive Barrow was out in his fields. He was driving his 1992 Steiger tractor, pulling a mechanical white 8000 planter, he had rebuilt with his own 2 hands. There were no microchips. There was no satellite uplink. There was only diesel hydraulics and steel. Earlier that morning, Clive had broken a drive chain on the planter. He hadn't called a dealer. He hadn't waited for a software update. He had climbed out of the cab, grabbed a master link from his toolbox, and fixed it in 20 minutes. As Clive made his turn at the end of his field, he looked across the road. He saw Derek's monstrous, beautiful green rig sitting dead in the mud, Derek standing outside, kicking the enormous tires in a fit of absolute despair. Clive didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just throttled up his old Steiger, the black exhaust, puffing into the sky, and kept planting 1 row at a time. The tortoise was officially passing the hare, and the rain was coming. The rain that finally arrived in late May of 2023 was not a gentle, nurturing shower. It was a torrential, angry deluge that dumped 4 inches of water onto Kearny County in a matter of hours. The ground, already saturated from early spring drizzles, could not hold the sudden volume. Fields turned into shallow brown lakes. Derek Whitmore's 8RX tractor remained stranded exactly where it had died. The mud swallowed the massive tires halfway to the axles. By the time a corporate technician from Plains Equipment Group finally arrived 4 days later, wading through knee-deep sludge with a diagnostic laptop shielded by an umbrella, the planting window had permanently slammed shut. Derek had barely seeded 1,000 of his 5,000 leased acres. The remaining 4,000 acres sat barren, drowning under standing water, completely ineligible for preventative planting crop insurance, because Derek, supremely confident in his speed, had opted out of the premium coverage to save capital. Across the blacktop, Clive Barrow's corn had already spiked an inch above the soil row, after perfectly spaced row. His old white 8,000 planter had dropped the seed into the optimal moisture zone just before the skies opened. But weather was only the first hammer blow. The second came from the Chicago Board of Trade. In late July, a massive geopolitical shift opened up grain exports from Eastern Europe, flooding the global market. Overnight, the record-breaking $7 corn that had fueled Kearny County's spending spree evaporated. The December futures contract plummeted to $3.90 a bushel. The mathematics of Derek's empire instantly collapsed. He was paying $400 an acre in cash rent, carrying millions in equipment debt at a climbing 7% interest rate, and paying top dollar for chemical inputs. At $4 corn, even if he harvested a miraculous 250 bushels an acre on the ground he did manage to plant, he would still be losing over $200 an acre. The atmosphere inside Heartland AgStar Financial shifted from a cozy country club to a triage ward. The same bank officers who had enthusiastically pushed operating notes the year before were suddenly locking their doors and refusing to return calls. In mid-September, Derek sat across from Nathaniel Finch in the banker's glass-walled office. The smug confidence that had defined Derek a year prior was completely gone. His face was drawn, the skin under his eyes bruised with exhaustion. "Nathaniel, you have to extend the terms on the combines," Derek pleaded, leaning over the polished mahogany desk. "If you restructure the principal and push the balloon payment to 2025, I can clear the operating note. I just need breathing room." Nathaniel Finch, wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, didn't look up from the file in front of him. He tapped a silver pen against the paperwork. The false camaraderie of the boom times had vanished, replaced by the cold, algorithmic reality of corporate banking. "Derek, the committee reviewed your portfolio yesterday," Nathaniel said, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "You have 0 unencumbered collateral. Your equipment depreciation schedule is significantly outpacing your equity. The X9 combines you bought for $700,000 each. They're appraising at $450 right now, because every over-leveraged operation in the Midwest is trying to dump them at the same time. The secondary market is completely flooded." "I have the leases." Derek countered, his voice cracking. I have the Miller 80. I have the vast majority of the prime ground in the valley. Leases are liabilities right now, Derek, not assets, Nathaniel replied coldly. Charlotte Miller's trust called me yesterday. You missed the September 1st cash rent installment. You are in default. The bank is declining your request for a loan modification. We will be freezing your operating line effective Friday. I strongly suggest you begin voluntary liquidation before we are forced to initiate repossession protocols. The news of Derek's frozen credit spread through the county diner and the co-op like a prairie fire. The green paint disease had officially entered its terminal stage. Derek wasn't the only one. Half a dozen other prominent farmers who had followed his lead were suddenly facing ruin, crushed under the weight of variable interest rates and plummeting commodity prices. 2 days later, Clive Barrow was working under his 1998 Case combine, greasing the rotor bearings ahead of harvest, when a pristine white Lexus SUV pulled into his gravel driveway. Out stepped Charlotte Miller. She looked entirely out of place in her designer trench coat, stepping carefully around the puddles of hydraulic fluid. Clive rolled out from under the machine on his creeper, wiping his greasy hands on a red shop rag. He didn't stand up immediately. He just watched her approach. "Clive," Charlotte said, offering a tight, anxious smile. "It's been a while. The farm looks exactly the same." "Steel doesn't change much, Charlotte." Clive rumbled, finally standing to his full height. "What brings you out from Chicago? Derek Whitmore mapping out a helipad on your 80 acres. Charlotte flushed her composure, slipping. "Derek's LLC breached the contract. He couldn't make the fall payment. We've formally terminated the lease. I came to see if you would be interested in taking the Miller 80 back for the upcoming season. We'd be willing to honor the previous rate of $250 an acre." For old time's sake, Clive leaned against the massive rear tire of his combine. He looked at his nephew Bradley, who had just walked out of the tool room. Bradley's eyes were wide, waiting for Clive to eagerly accept the return of their prized adjacent field. Instead, Clive shook his head slowly. "Old times are dead, Charlotte," Clive said, his voice flat and uncompromising. "You didn't care about old times when Derek flashed a pile of borrowed cash in your face. The market has changed. Corn is under $4. Fertilizer is sky high. $250 an acre is financial suicide today. But it's prime ground, Clive. You farmed it for 20 years. "And I know what it produces," Clive replied. "I'll give you $160 an acre. Cash, paid today. Take it or leave it." Charlotte gasped. "That's insulting. That barely covers the property taxes and the trust administration fees. Then let it sit to weeds," Clive said, turning his back on her and reaching for his grease gun. "Call Derek. Maybe his bank will write you a check." Charlotte stood in the cold wind for a long time, her knuckles white as she gripped her expensive purse. She looked at the desolate, unplanted fields across the road, then back at Clive's sturdy paid-off iron. "Fine," she whispered bitterly. $160. I'll have the lawyers draft the papers. Date." As her SUV crunched back down the driveway, Bradley let out a low whistle. "Uncle Clive, that was ruthless. You just cut her knees out from under her." "No, Brad," Clive said, pumping the grease gun. "I just adjusted to the reality she helped create. The bubble popped. Now we sweep up the glass." By the winter of 2024, Kearney County had become a graveyard of ambition. The freezing wind howling across the plains seemed to carry the sound of shattering livelihoods. The local newspaper, once filled with glossy spreads of agricultural innovation, now dedicated entire pages to legal notices of foreclosure bankruptcy filings and absolute auctions. Derek Whitmore's collapse was total. He hadn't just lost his leases. The bank had come for his deeded acres. The generational farmhouse, where he grew up, the state-of-the-art machine, sheds he had built with borrowed millions, and his fleet of immaculate green equipment were all seized by Heartland AgStar Financial. The Ozark vacation home was liquidated to cover a fraction of the outstanding tax liabilities. Derek and his wife had quietly moved into a rented duplex on the edge of town, his heavy-duty dually truck replaced by an aging sedan. The culmination of the tragedy was scheduled for the second Tuesday in February. It was billed as the largest agricultural liquidation auction in state history. The bank had hired Harrison Caldwell, a legendary auctioneer, known for his rapid-fire chant and ruthless efficiency to liquidate the Whitmore estate. The morning of the auction was bitterly cold, the sky the color of a bruised iron skillet. Hundreds of pickup trucks lined the county road leading to Derek's former property. Farmers had traveled from 3 states away smelling blood in the water. They weren't there to support a fallen neighbor. They were scavengers, circling a carcass, hoping to pick up lightly used technology at distressed prices. Clive Barrow and Bradley arrived early. They parked their rusted 2004 farm truck a quarter-mile down the road and walked in. The sheer scale of the equipment lined up in the frozen pasture was staggering. Row after row of John Deere X9 combines massive articulated tractors, high-clearance sprayers, and 50-foot tillage implements sat gleaming under the grey sky. It looked less like a farm and more like a military staging ground. Bradley stared at the rows of machinery, his breath pluming in the freezing air. It's sickening, Uncle Clive. Millions of dollars of iron just sitting here. To think a year ago I was begging you to buy into this. Debt is a master of disguise. Brad. Clive said, his hands shoved deep into his heavy canvas coat. It dresses up as success until the music stops. At exactly 9 in the morning, Harrison Caldwell climbed atop the bed of a customized sound truck, tapped the microphone, and the execution began. The auction was a bloodbath. Because the agricultural economy was in a widespread recession, nobody had the capital or the credit to pay retail prices. A tractor that Derek had signed a $500,000 note for just 18 months prior struggled to break $200,000. The bankers from Heartland AgStar, including Nathaniel Finch, stood in a tight cluster near the auctioneer's truck, their faces growing paler with every hammer drop. The bank was taking massive losses on the depreciated collateral. Clive didn't bid on a single piece of equipment. He stood in the back of the crowd watching the proceedings with stoic silence. He had no interest in $500,000 machines that required software subscriptions to start the engine. He was waiting for the afternoon. He was waiting for the dirt. At 1 o'clock, the auction shifted from machinery to real estate. The crowd thinned out. Few men had the liquidity to buy land in this economic climate. Harrison Caldwell held up a plat map. All right, gentlemen, we are moving to the real property. Tract 1, 320 acres of prime, tiled, terraced Kearney County black dirt. The crown jewel of the Whitmore home place. Do I hear 12,000 an acre? Give me 12. 10. Do I hear 10,000? Silence hung over the frozen field. 2 years ago, this ground would have sparked a bidding war at $15,000 an acre. Today, nobody moved. Give me 8,000. 8,000 an acre to start. Caldwell pleaded, his rhythm slowing. 6,000. A voice rang out from the back. The crowd turned. It was Clive Barrow. He had raised his numbered bidding card. Nathaniel Finch leaned over and whispered frantically into Caldwell's ear. The bank needed at least 9,000 an acre to cover the remaining deficit. Caldwell nodded tightly and went back to the microphone. I have 6. Do I hear 6.5? 6,500. Will anybody give me 6.5? The silence stretched on, broken only by the bitter wind whistling through the empty grain bins. Derek Whitmore, standing on the fringes of the crowd with his collar turned up against the cold, looked at Clive. There was no hatred in Derek's eyes anymore. There was only the hollow, devastating realization of a man who understood too late that he had bet his life on an illusion. 6,000 going once. Caldwell called out, the resignation heavy in his voice. Going twice. Sold. 320 acres to bidder number 42. Clive lowered his card. He turned to Bradley, who was staring at him in absolute shock. "Uncle Clive," Bradley stammered. "That's nearly $2 million. How? Where are we getting the financing for that? The banks aren't lending." Clive reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, battered leather checkbook. "We aren't going to the bank, Brad," Clive said softly. "For 40 years, while everyone else bought new trucks, built fancy shops, and upgraded perfectly good combines just to avoid paying taxes I saved. I kept our overhead in the dirt. I banked the windfalls and survived the droughts. Cash is king when the empire falls." Clive walked over to the Clarking trailer. He wrote a personal check for $1.92 million, draining a reserve account he had protected with his life since the 1980s farm crisis. He didn't just buy land. He bought undeniable sovereignty. As they walked back to their old dented pickup truck, the repo crews were already firing up Derek's unsold equipment, driving the magnificent green machines onto massive flatbed trailers to be hauled away to wholesale lots. Clive stopped and placed a hand on Bradley's shoulder, forcing the young man to look at the departing convoy of repossessed dreams. "Take a good look, Brad," Clive said, his voice cutting through the freezing wind. "That is what happens when you let the world tell you how to farm. They sell you convenience, they sell you speed, and they buy your freedom in exchange. We might be slow and we might be dirty, but tomorrow morning we are going to wake up and farm our own land, and we won't owe a dime to any man in a suit." The spring of 2024 arrived in Kearney County, not with the roar of factory-fresh diesel engines, but with a quiet, bruised resilience. The landscape had been radically altered. The sprawling, perfectly synchronized fleets of $500,000 machinery that had dominated the horizon the previous year were entirely gone, dispersed to wholesale lots and foreign buyers. In their place, surviving farmers pulled tarp-covered 20-year-old tractors out of the weeds, desperately trying to resurrect forgotten iron to get a crop in the ground. For Clive Barrow, the season presented a monumental logistical challenge. With the addition of the reclaimed Miller 80 and the 320 acres of the Whitmore home place, his operation had suddenly expanded to nearly 2,000 acres. To tackle this massive footprint, he still relied entirely on his 1998 case WAS. Combine his 1992 Steiger and the mechanical white planter. The county watched, waiting for the stubborn old man to finally break under the sheer volume of the labor. They underestimated Bradley. The foreclosure auction had been a crucible for Clive's nephew. The agribusiness degree he had earned at the state university, which had previously filled his head with buzzwords about leverage and aggressive scaling, finally found a practical application. Bradley stopped looking at glossy brochures and started looking at salvage yards. Instead of begging Clive to take out a loan for a modern tractor, Bradley spent 3 weeks scouring online forums and regional junkyards. He located an aftermarket standalone GPS auto-steer module, pulled from a wrecked sprayer in Ohio. He bought it for $800, a fraction of the $25,000 factory option. Using a soldering iron, a bundle of zip ties, and a dog-eared wiring schematic, Bradley successfully retrofitted the advanced steering system into the cab of the 32-year-old Steiger. "It won't give us satellite yield mapping," Bradley told his uncle, wiping grease off his forehead as the green light on the salvaged monitor flickered to life. But it will keep the rows dead straight, and it means we can run the planter at night without overlapping. We can double our operational hours without spending a dime on interest." Clive looked at the glowing screen strapped to the dashboard of his rusted tractor, then looked at his nephew. A rare, genuine smile cracked the old farmer's weathered face. "That's farming, Brad, using your brain instead of the bank's money." When the soil temperatures finally hit 50 degrees in late April, Barrow Farms mobilized. They ran the Steiger in 20-hour shifts. Clive drove during the day, breathing in the familiar scent of diesel, and turned earth, while Bradley took the night shift, guided by the salvaged GPS monitor under the vast, starry prairie sky. The old equipment grumbled and leaked the occasional drop of hydraulic fluid, but it never stopped. There were no proprietary software lockouts. There were no sensor failures that required a corporate technician. When a shear pin broke, they replaced it in 5 minutes and kept moving. It was during a brief pause in the planting frenzy that Clive had his final encounter with the ghost of the green paint disease. A blown hydraulic hose on the planter forced Clive to make a mid-morning run into town. He pulled his dented pickup into the parking lot of the Plains Equipment Group dealership, the lot which just 18 months ago had been overflowing with brand-new inventory was dismally empty. Inside the showroom the air was stale, the fluorescent lights buzzing loudly overhead. Clive walked up to the parts counter and dropped the blown rubber hose onto the metal counter. "Need this replicated. High-pressure half-inch fittings," Clive said, not looking up as he dug his wallet out of his grease-stained overalls. "I can get that cut and crimped for you in about 10 minutes, Clive." The voice was quiet, stripped of its former booming confidence. Clive looked up. Standing behind the counter wearing a standard-issue grey dealership polo shirt with a name tag pinned to the chest was Derek Whitmore. Derek looked 10 years older. The arrogant fire in his eyes had been entirely extinguished, replaced by a hollow, weary humility. He wasn't the golden boy of Midwest agronomy anymore. He was an hourly parts clerk, working for the very dealership that had happily fed him the rope he used to hang his own empire. For a long moment, the only sound in the cavernous room was the hum of the vending machine in the corner. Clive didn't gloat. He didn't offer a smug reminder of his warnings from the co-op all those months ago. He simply looked at the man who had lost everything. "Your grandfather's old farm planted beautifully, Derek," Clive said softly. "The terraces are holding the water well. You did a good job maintaining the soil profile while you had it." Derek stopped reaching for the bulk hydraulic hose. He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the scratched metal counter. "My grandfather laid those terraces out in the 70s. Derek whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I traded it all for leather seats and cloud data. I thought I was outsmarting the system. I was just the easiest mark they ever had." "The system is designed to eat pride," Clive replied, his tone rough, but completely devoid of malice. "It chewed up my father, too. It's a hard lesson, but you're still young enough to learn it. A man isn't dead just because his pockets are empty. Get my hose crimped. There's daylight burning." Derek nodded tightly, a flicker of genuine gratitude flashing across his face. "Yes, sir. 10 minutes." By November, the harvest of 2024 was safely in the bins. The yields were not record-breaking, and the commodity prices remained terribly low, hovering around $4 a bushel. Across Kearney County, the few remaining leveraged farms bled cash, barely scraping together enough capital to service their monumental debts. But on Barrow Farms, the mathematics were beautiful in their simplicity. There were no balloon payments looming in December. There were no exorbitant cash rent checks due. The aging case combine had chewed through 2,000 acres of paid-off corn and soybeans. Every dollar that came across the elevator scales, minus the cost of seed fuel and fertilizer, belonged entirely to Clive and Bradley. On a frigid Thanksgiving morning, Clive stood at the edge of his expanded property, looking out over the frozen, harvested stalks. The rusted Steiger sat silently in the tin shed behind him, a testament to survival. He had kept his iron, he had kept his soul, and against all the modern odds, he had kept the farm. The story of Kearney County isn't just a cautionary tale about farming. It's a brutal reminder for all of us. Debt often dresses up as success, and convenience usually costs you your freedom. Clive Barrow proved that true ownership and resilience beat flashy illusions every single time. If this story of old-school grit and survival resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who respects hard work, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories.